They poured the water over me like it was meant to wash something off the marble. Me, my belly, the thing inside me that already answered to my name when I put a hand over it. It wasn't a glass that tipped by accident. It was deliberate. The ice drew a line of little white stars across my skin before the cold hit, and I remember the way the chandelier light turned each droplet into a tiny accusation. They all watched. Fine dining patrons froze mid-lift of fork and knife. Waiters stopped as if their training had been replaced with a script to gawk. A woman at the next cable clutched her napkin like a life preserver. Someone laughed, sharp and brittle, and then the room shrank to the sound of Vanessa's voice, bright and unapologetic, cutting clean through the hush. "Show them how it looks," she said. Her smile didn't belong to the rest of the room. It belonged on magazine covers. It belonged to a family who believed shame could be arranged like place settings. My hand went to my stomach before my face could. The motion was automatic. "Baby, don't be frightened," my fingers said without moving my mouth. For a second, between the sting and the cold, I thought the building would tilt. I thought maybe the sound of the water would be the last thing I'd hear in public for a long time. Vanessa owned the place, the Gilded Rose, though she rarely cooked. She owned the space the way someone owns a rumor, with a private ledger of favors and a ledger of people to embarrass for sport. She'd found me the way wealthy people find inconveniences, interesting at first, then tedious. She'd discovered that humiliating me in front of her crowd was cheaper than therapy, and more fun. "You're a spectacle," she said, leaning forward. Her perfume, expensive, floral, impossible to ignore, floated toward me. For a moment I thought that might be worse than the cold. That scent carried everything she wanted me to be. Trash, a cautionary tale, a lesson for someone like her fiancé not to look in the wrong direction. The floor under me was frightfully hard. My knees bent as I tried to steady my breath and my balance at the same time. The water ran down my ribcage and pooled at the hem of my dress. Someone, probably the owner, shoved a hand into my back like I was a coat on their arm, and the grip was not gentle. "Get him out," Vanessa said, and clapped the last syllable like a judge dropping a gavel. I wasn't thinking in sentences. I was thinking in images. A ribeye I couldn't afford, a lipstick smear on an old scarf, the velvet curtain at the Velvet Room when the music swelled and the crowd drowned out the conversation I couldn't afford to have. I was thinking of all the small, careful arrangements that had kept my life upright until they hadn't. Then Henry came in. He didn't stride like an actor entering a stage.
He stepped into the doorway, and the room did this odd, involuntary thing. Every neck turned. He moved slowly, the way sunlight does when it decides to stop hesitating and falls on something it wants to keep warm. Men straightened, women checked their reflections. The murmurs that had been a current when I first remembered Vanessa's laugh died into a wide, sudden silence. He saw me, and the color left his face, the way rain leaves the sky a different color. For half a breath I thought he'd keep walking, that this would be one of the many things my life had become, a spectacle divorced from consequence. Then he crossed the room like it belonged to him, which I suppose, in his way, it did. He didn't shout, he didn't call her names, he didn't need to. He stepped to me and folded his coat over my shoulders. The coat was huge and smelled like him, wood and something soft underneath, like old books in safe rooms. The coat absorbed the water and my shame, and the motion of it felt like someone putting a roof over a leak mid-storm. "This is my husband," he said, and it was the simplest sentence, with a syllable weight that made everyone else small. No one laughed then. The words were not a proclamation meant to be argued with. They were a command that rearranged the room's priorities. The chandeliers kept glinting. The marble didn't stop being marble, but Vanessa's face lost its practiced color. The owner took a step back. Vanessa's laugh stuttered and died. Someone somewhere cleared their throat as if embarrassed for having been entertained by cruelty. "Get him an umbrella," Henry told a waiter, and his voice was a low, even plane that made the air feel warmer. "Sit him down." They moved me like I was something fragile. I was still clutching my belly, but it wasn't about the baby then. It was about that little private animal of hope that surprised me every morning and kicked like a living promise. The moment of Henry's coat wasn't a rescue, so much as a naming. He said the words and the room had to learn new rules. My shame was no longer theirs to curate. He picked me up then. Not a helicopter lift from a romance novel. Nothing performative. He slid his arms under my legs, bracing me against his chest as if he were guarding me from falling. People opened a path for us like water parts around a rock. No one touched us. I kept my face hidden against his shirt so I wouldn't see Vanessa's mouth rearranged into triumph. He carried me out of the restaurant past the clustered bodies and the stunned staff and the people who clapped, because of course some found the spectacle irresistible even then. He set me down by the curb and guided me into the back seat of his car as if he were tucking me into a small private world. In the car, his hands were everything, steady, large, efficient. He wiped my face with a napkin he fished from his pocket, the motion practiced and intimate in a way that made my muscles weep relief. He didn't pepper me with questions.
He let silence build a small island between us. Then he asked, quietly, "Are you okay?" Yes, I lied at first, the way you lie to keep the moment small and manageable. The lie tasted like copper. "I'm fine." "You don't have to say that because of them," he said. The corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You can be honest with me." I let myself be honest. I told him I was cold. I told him my throat hurt from swallowing. I told him that for a second the world had gone very small and very loud at once. I told him 1,000 tiny things that were not the whole story, but were the edges of it. He listened. He didn't lean back against the leather or let his eyes slide out of the window. He watched me like he was memorizing an ugly page of a book because he loved the book anyway. When I said Vanessa's name, he made a modest noise, something like a blade sliding into its sheath. "I want to go home," I said, and the words were both a plea and a plan. "You are home," he answered, "not here." We didn't go straight to some glittering mansion. He drove us to a small private townhouse he kept outside of the public orbit, a place with thick walls and a good stove and a coat rack by the door. He took off his coat and draped it over my shoulders again. Homework for safety, a repeated liturgy. The coat is a safe word between us. It tells me that an arm will follow. It also tells the world a story if the world is stubborn enough to look. He made tea while I shivered into the warmth. He moved around the kitchen with a certainty that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with familiarity. Retrieving a thermometer, wrapping my damp dress in a towel, finding extra blankets. His hands were efficient like a surgeon's, but tender like a lover's. He kept calling me by my name in a voice that made each syllable a small blessing. "Benji," he'd say, and my bones answered. "If you want, you'll come to the police with me," he said eventually, while the kettle bubbled in little impatient crescendos. "We don't have to let this sit." I shook my head. "It's social. It's gossip. If we make a fuss, they'll spin it. Vanessa will turn us into the villain." He frowned. His brow did the thing it did when he was thinking. He moves ahead like a chess master planning a funeral for a rival piece. "Then we'll be louder than their spin," he said. "There are better ways to make her step back." He did not promise to crush her under his heel or to buy the restaurant and close it. He promised something else, a pattern he returned to like prayer, measured, legal, unavoidable. He would involve his team. He would ask for apologies. He would consult lawyers. He would, he said plainly, use the tools he had. His words were steady and reasonable, but when he sat across from me, hands laced, you could see in his posture the shape of someone not used to being surprised by courage in others.
The silence between us was full of small, soft things. The kettle's dying whistle, my baby shifting inside me like a new moon tugging the tides, the way his fingers played with the pattern on the tablecloth without disturbing it. "I'm married now," I blurted out, and it hit the room like a thrown stone. It didn't mean what it would mean to most people. It meant the world had shifted beneath me again, but this time someone had chosen to hold on. He laughed, soft, incredulous. "You are always telling me things as if they are secrets with explosive power," he said. "What does this one want from me?" I laughed too, a cough-like sound. "You already know." He did. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken the flak so calmly at the restaurant. We had a way of being together that wasn't showy. We had a private geography that included many small, ordinary moments. The way he made coffee just how I liked it. The way I fell asleep to the hum of his phone when the city was too loud to let me rest. We were married in a quiet ceremony that was more an agreement than a spectacle. The city did not know the marriage existed. The world could keep its assumptions. I told him about the velvet room the way you tell someone about a scar you used to hide, with a little shame, a lot of claim. My father had left when I was young. He'd taken our savings and the calendar off the wall and left a string of excuses like used tape. My mother kept 2 jobs and a smile until she couldn't keep them both, and the house learned the sound of living on the verge of being empty.
The Velvet Room was not a glamorous refuge. It was a place that had economies, of looks, of timing, of favors traded, and debts remembered. I worked there because it was the only thing that didn't ask me for a reference or a past I didn't have. It was honest in the way that the hospital had been nice to me when I volunteered. Practical, routine, necessary. I promised myself I'd leave when I had a dorm deposit saved and a textbook to prove I was serious about nursing school. I met Henry there first as a patron who had been given wrong directions by the velvet curtain and the cutlery. He watched. He listened. He came back with a book one night, not a bouquet or a diamond, but a book that he'd scribbled a note in the cover of. It said something like, "If you need a place to rest, there is one." He was not showy then either. He was careful and curious, and he asked about my plans like hydrogen asks about oxygen, hungry, but not consuming. He found out about my nursing school plan because I couldn't not tell him. People told him things because they felt as if he held secrets like sacred things. He didn't always give advice. Sometimes he just paid for my fare or lent me a coat. Once he asked very quietly whether I wanted better than what I had, and when I said yes, he took that as his cue to be a part of my plan. The pregnancy came like everything else in my life, unannounced, messy, and absolutely real.
We didn't plan it, not the way people say planning should happen with charts and calendars. It just was. For a while it lived in us like a secret hut we kept between our two hearts. We married, small and private, because there are reasons you marry in secret when your partner's world is a kind of minefield. He didn't want the scrutiny. I didn't want the pity. It felt like a sensible thing to do, like putting on an umbrella before a storm. It also felt like wanting. There were nights he called me at 2 a.m. to ask whether I was having bad dreams. There were afternoons when he'd show up at campus with coffee and a reluctant grin. He believed in me in the way people believe in bridges. They said it could hold weight, and it did. I started my nursing prerequisites, kept my shifts at the Velvet Room to the barest minimum so I could study, and slowly, inch by inch, bought myself less of a future on credit and more on terms I could sign. Vanessa had been an irritation, an unavoidable bruise. Our paths crossed at parties where she checked her wristwatch as if the world were behind schedule and she were owed apologies for being on time. She loved to make judgments that sounded like charity. She loved to remake conversations to her benefit. She noticed things a little too sharply. When I arrived at a gala with Henry as a guest, she would narrate it for everyone within earshot as if I had walked onto a stage. Maybe that's why I thought I could navigate her. Or maybe I was foolish and thought that because Henry's world was mine in secret, his steadiness would trickle into mine. People who have never been looked at by the city think that being seen will protect them, and for a short time it did. But people like Vanessa are practiced at seeing others as parts bound for dramatic ends. She took my visibility and turned it into a spectacle. Back at the townhouse, Henry sat across from me with his hands folded. He had called his lawyer in the car, the kind of micro-move that defined the man, small, invisible steps that make consequences bloom later. The loud reverend in me wanted to scream at Vanessa, to reduce her to a headline, to show her what the world looks like when you trip someone in front of a crowd. Henry's approach smelled of a different kind of fury, one that read statutes for poetry and used legal counsel like armor. He steepled his fingers and said, "Do you want me to make them apologize?" "I don't want to make anyone swallow anything they don't mean," I said. It was a line I used to keep myself from being consumed by rage. "I'm tired of fights that make me smaller." "You won't be smaller," he said. "Not on my watch." His promise sounded like the hum of a machine being turned toward a direction. The house filled with it, the small sounds of him plotting protection. A lawyer on retainer who would respond with letters before the next morning. A PR strategist who would prepare us for outcomes. A security detail who would do a thorough sweep of any place Vanessa touched. "Do I want the apologies?" I repeated. I thought of the owner and the way he shoved his hand against my back. I thought of the people who would find the video and make memes, because the internet is always a hungry thing that eats wounds clean. "I want to keep living," I admitted, "and I want the people who did this to stop feeling entitled to my life." "Then we'll make sure it's costly for them to continue," he said, and his tone was carefully even. "Legally costly, reputationally costly, professionally costly. Not bloody, not illegal. We'll be precise." I believed him because he had been precise before. This was the man who ran corporations and made decisions that looked like inevitabilities. If he had a plan, it would be quiet and unassailable, and probably terrifying to the people who trafficked in small cruelties.
That night, I blocked a dozen numbers that might later become instruments of shame. I changed passwords. I slept in the coat he had draped over me in the restaurant. An almost childish thing, but it comforted me more than words. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was a small sound, nothing like the clamoring it would become, but it made the pit of my stomach flip. I put the device down at first, like touching a hot stove. Then I let it sit on the table while Henry made coffee with the kind of competence that implies centuries of practice. He didn't check my screen for me. He waited as if he already knew the news. "You should probably see this," he said gently, placing a cup in front of me. The first notification was from an unknown account, a blurred photo of the restaurant with a caption I didn't want to read. Then another, a clip that someone had recorded on a phone, shaky and voyeuristic. The angles were lopsided. I could see Vanessa laughing and the glass tilting toward me. There was a smear of water on my dress and a sound that made my face heat. My hands shook as I scrolled. The comments below were a small war, some sympathetic, many cruel, and a few declaring moral verdicts they didn't have the right to pronounce. I felt like I was watching an argument about my life through someone else's window. "Do not engage," Henry said without looking up from his cup. "Let me block them," I whispered. "I will not let this define me." He nodded. He was the kind of partner who took my wants as if they were instructions in a machine he was trained to operate. He tapped on my phone with a practiced flick, blocking accounts and reporting posts. He set alerts to flag anything that used my name in conjunction with Vanessa's. He hired a digital cleanup team within hours. He made noises on the phone that were always the same, short, precise, money buying the right people to be ready. But it was faster than us. One clip had already gone to someone who ran a gossip column. Within hours, the hashtag had been born. People I hadn't spoken to in years wrote messages of faux surprise. Friends called to check in, some in pity, some in anger. The Velvet Room texted me and asked whether I was safe. My hands were full of messages. My phone was an organ spasm that never stopped. I had the nauseous sense of being moved through other people's mouths. Stories were being made about me without my consent. They filled in blanks with the kind of cruelty that calls itself entertainment. Someone had dug up photographs from 5 years ago and posted them beside the video, as if context were optional. Henry watched all of this with a stillness that made me envious. He didn't react with shouting or rage. He reacted with paperwork. He drafted emails as if he were fencing with words. He instructed his legal counsel to prepare a cease and desist. He told his publicist to prepare a statement that would refocus the narrative away from sensationalism and towards responsibility. He wanted our truth to be the truth the world had to deal with. "Do you want to go public?" he asked finally. My first instinct was no. Privacy had saved me before. But the second instinct, the more honest one, was yes. I wanted the record set straight. I wanted Vanessa to understand that curiosity could be weaponized, and that there were costs to it. I wanted the people who had been entertained by cruelty to see there were consequences. "I don't know what's best," I admitted. "Then we'll make it what you want," he said. "You lead. I'll follow the way I always do." There were other noises under the clamor, messages to Henry's business associates, frantic texts from Vanessa's fiancé, Brendan York, asking for a meeting that he tried to make sound conciliatory. There were messages from Vanessa herself, icy, theatrical, trying to reframe the incident as a misunderstanding. Her father, Gregory, issued a calm, measured statement through his PR man that called the night an unfortunate incident and promised an internal review. On screen, the footage looped. My hand went to my belly again, as if some part of the world still could be quiet. I watched Henry work. He sent demands for raw footage from the restaurant's security cameras, emails requesting all staff statements, and a terse note to Vanessa's father asking for direct contact information. I did not want to be the kind of person who took comfort in the tools of a billionaire. I wanted my own strength to be enough. But want and need are different currencies, and sometimes they clear at different counters. I let him handle the storm because I was exhausted and because I had seen how he bent the world toward safety. Then, in the midst of it all, my phone chimed with a new message. It was from an anonymous account, a screenshot of a private conversation from the Velvet Room. Someone had found threads from months ago, someone who knew where to look. The message was meant to sting, implied transactions, names edited by whoever had cobbled the image together, a tone that suggested there was more dirt to be unearthed if the public wished it.
I felt the old shame rise up like bile. The velvet room had not been a secret, it had been my survival, but survival is sometimes a headline. The message said things that I had never wanted to tell anyone outside of that small, dimly lit world. It suggested that my choices defined me in a single flat line. I closed the phone and put it face down on the table. The baby stilled, like something that knows when a parent has been startled. Henry sat forward, his fingers folded again. He did not look at the phone. He looked at me, at the small contour of my throat moving with breath. "You will decide what to reveal," he said, with a patient fierceness. "I will not drag you into a court of public opinion unless you ask me to, but I will not allow your history to be used as a weapon." I began, but the words tangled in my mouth.
How could I explain that I didn't just want privacy? I wanted dignity. How could I explain that the velvet room was complicated, that it had fed me, taught me, and sometimes hurt me, but that it wasn't a sin to have survived? "You don't owe anyone an explanation about how you kept yourself alive," he said softly. "Not ever." I wanted to believe him. I clung to the coat on the back of the chair like it was a flag. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and a hope I was not sure I deserved. Then another notification, this one from a more vicious angle. Someone had dug up an old rumor and sewn it to a more damaging lie. It was the way these things escalate, a small spark finding tinder. The message said they were going to release a dossier on me if Vanessa didn't get a public apology and if Gregory's restaurants didn't close certain accounts. The implication was that chaos would be profitable for someone. Henry's jaw tightened. He stood and walked to the window, looked out in a way that had nothing to do with the view. He spoke into his phone in low tones, arranging calls, directions, legal excursions. He turned back to me and said simply, "They'll regret choosing this hill to climb." His certainty made the house hum. I took a breath, and for the first time that morning let myself imagine the possibility that we could end up on the other side of this, vindicated, not with trumpets and lavish gestures, but with quiet restoration. It felt both possible and ridiculous. I chose not to be the thing the internet would make of me that day. I chose to be someone small and stubborn. I texted 4 people, the director at the nursing program, my supervisor at the velvet room, my mother, and a friend who had been there before the money and the suit. I told them I was all right and that I would be taking steps to protect myself. When I put the phone down, the house felt suddenly too big. My baby moved again, a tiny, confident punch against my ribs. It steadied me. It was a reminder that some things are immune to outrage. You can pour scorn over a belly, and the life inside will adjust and push back. We spent the rest of the day preparing. Henry's people assembled like a discreet battalion, lawyers with small calloused hands on keyboards, a PR woman who smelled of mint and ruthless competence, and a security team who cataloged every possible vulnerability. They spoke of reputational damage and bankruptcy filings, and the logistics of freezing accounts in that calm, efficient way that made catastrophe sound like an itemized list. Vanessa, on the other hand, moved with public poise. Her posts were aggrieved and performative, images of charity galas, of volunteer work at animal shelters, all soft filters and blushing captions. She called the incident a misunderstanding and claimed that she regretted making anyone feel uncomfortable. It was the kind of half-apology that asked forgiveness without admitting culpability.
On the 3rd day, the first reporter came to the townhouse. He tried to step around the discreet perimeter of security and ask questions in a way that pretended to be casual. Henry's assistant met him with a written statement and a friendly, instructive tone. The reporter left with nothing but a stack of legal threats and a duller appetite. In the private interstices of our days, Henry would cook. He had a way of searing a ribeye so that the meat seemed to apologize for being so good. The smell of it became our small contraband, the normalcy of a hot meal in the middle of a small war. He would hum while he cooked. I would watch him and feel something like a future making itself in the corners of the kitchen. And yet, the phone never stopped. A new account with a different name would post a blurred clip. A friend would forward a screenshot from a group chat where someone had made a joke that was not a joke. The world's appetite for spectacle is not easily sated, and it finds ways to feed regardless of the damage left in its wake. One evening, as the sun died and the townhouse lights came up, a message arrived in a way that made my throat go cold. It was from Vanessa herself, plain and brassy. "Care to explain how a charity night ended with you soaked in my restaurant?" It read. "I don't bite, Benji. Tell me the truth." I read it 3 times and then pressed my thumb to his name in my contacts. Henry's thumbnail clicked as he set down a pan. He turned, and for a heartbeat, the man who had been the architect of corporate mergers and ruin was only the man who loved me. "Do you want me to reply?" he asked. "No," I said. "No, I won't feed her." "Good." His voice was a low seal. I blocked her. I would rather she rage into empty air than have me answer her with anything she could use. It was an act of small rebellion that steadied me. That night, when the city quieted, I lay awake and listened to the hum of the house. The coat draped across the chair cast a long shadow. The baby moved, a steady tap-tap like someone knocking on a future door. I pressed my hand to my belly and whispered promises I had not yet earned. We had made the first move. We had decided to fight with the instruments of consequence rather than spectacle. That was Henry's gift and my decision. I felt both relieved and unsettled. The thing about being seen is that the world will keep looking, and sometimes the eyes will not be kind. When the next morning brought a new string of notifications, a thin thread of messages from strangers who claimed to have more dirt, I felt a quiet panic. Not the loud, screaming panic of old, but a restrained, flinty worry that had nothing to do with my outward composure. The baby hiccuped, a tiny rebellion. "Stay here," Henry said softly. "Don't engage until I tell you." "I need to see who is saying these things," I countered. My voice had the stubbornness of someone refusing to be made small. "You don't," he said simply. "Trust me. You rest."
Let me shield you. I looked at him. He was offering me shelter in a world that loved to strip people bare for headlines. I swallowed my pride and nodded. He picked up his phone and began to type. I watched as his fingers moved, precise, deliberate. Then he stopped and looked at me with a softness that belonged between 2 people who had learned how to be patient with each other's scars. "I will be careful," he promised. I believed him, maybe too easily. The truth is, belief is sometimes a small, necessary act. It keeps you breathing. Then the phone buzzed like a bug grinding its wings against glass. This time, the notification that lit the screen was not a rumor, not a blurry clip. It was a file, a document someone had plastered with accusations wrapped in supposed proof. It was a dossier someone had assembled, as if to suggest that they had done the city's work for them. I felt the air drop out of my lungs. The baby kicked hard, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Henry's jaw tightened. He exhaled like a man who had been handed a complicated chessboard and a film reel of all his moves. "Show me," he said, and reached for my phone with a hunger that was not cruel, but urgent. I handed it over. The document scrolled beneath his thumb, and his face did something I had not often seen. It went very still, like a lake before a storm. He read, his lips moving slightly, tasting each line. "They're trying to tie your past to the present," he said finally, as if narrating evidence to a jury. "They're trying to make your survival look like a narrative of guilt. It's a classic smear. They'll do anything to keep their headlines selling." "What are they threatening?" I asked. My voice was small. "To leak everything," he said. "Photos, conversations, financial insinuations. They want leverage." The baby kicked again, insistent, alive. It was as if the life inside my body rejected the idea of being used. He put his phone down and folded his hands. For the first time since the incident, he let a quiet, edged thing appear. A professional readiness that smelled faintly of a courtroom and the scent of someone who knows how to make other people's power crumble. "They will regret trying to use you to get to me," he said. "But we do this on terms that don't let them beat you." I felt something in me steady and harden like a stone poured with resin. We would fight. We would do it legally. We would not allow the world to decide what my life was worth. I let the resolve fill the shape of me, like the way a draft fills a room after a window is shut.
Outside, the city carried on. Inside, the house brimmed with plans. The phone chimed again. The baby moved, as if to say, I am here. The world could try to make me into a lesson. It could try to make my past into a headline.
But there was a man in a coat who had put himself between me and the rest of the world. And for all his money and influence, what he gave me that day was not an address or a lawsuit. It was the steady sense of being defended. And that, for now, was everything. And that, for now, was everything. If you love dramatic BL stories like this, hit subscribe. Just a quick line. And stay with me a little longer. There's more to come. The next week moved in a rhythm that was not mine. Conference calls, timestamps, the kind of careful verbosity that intends to mean danger. Henry's team worked like a quiet engine. They drew up letters that were patient and cold, the legal equivalent of a scalpel. They sent them to Vanessa, to her father's company, to the owner of the Gilded Rose. They requested CCTV footage, payroll records, staff statements, and the raw files of every shaky phone clip that had been shared. They subpoenaed, then waited, and in waiting, they built a trap that smelled faintly of inevitability. I spent most of my days between the townhouse and a patch of the city that felt small and human, the campus library, the clinic practice lab, the narrow bench outside the nursing school building where I would eat anything Henry had managed to make, usually an overdone ribeye he swore tasted better the second day, and try to remember the cadence of my life before headlines. People stared sometimes, other times they nodded like conspirators. Most days felt like walking under a weather front that might break open at any moment. The media grew hungry. Every outlet wanted the angle. Some wanted scandal, some wanted spectacle, one or two wanted a quiet human piece about resilience, but the noise drowned the subtler stations. A gossip column posted a timeline stitched from public posts and hearsay. Another ran a sympathetic piece about my past, as if pity could pay rent. The comments became a geography unto themselves, some map of vitriol and a few islands of compassion. Henry, as always, moved on a different plane. He refused to be performative in the ways that would feed the monster. He instead began the kind of slow, precise work he did best: document, corroborate, and present. There were days he would bring me stacks of paper, employment records, sworn statements from staff who detained their disgust for a different kind of courage, bank records that showed a curious pattern of favors and donations from the Sullivan accounts to the Gilded Rose. He had his team trace the restaurant's loans, the insurer's notes, the accounts the restaurant relied upon. They found irregularities, small ones that, when linked together, suggested a culture of paying for favors and paying for silence. This is not just about what happened at the Gilded Rose, his lead counsel told me once, when I sat at the far end of a long table and tried to keep my hands from tangling. It's about making sure the people who profit from humiliation are held accountable.
That sentence, accountable, settled in my chest and grew roots. There were meetings that left me breathless. I sat in a glass-walled room while a legal team explained a course of action that involved cease and desists, formal complaints, and a very public press conference. They told me what evidence they had: the owner's rough shove caught on a different clip, a staff member's handwritten note about the lack of training, a private message from Vanessa in which she bragged about teaching him a lesson. They told me what they needed from me: willingness to speak, to sign affidavits, to be the human face of a complex narrative. I wanted to hide. I wanted to curl around the baby and be small and safe. The internet had a way of making privacy a fragile thing. But every time I felt myself retreat, I thought about the kid who would one day read headlines about this moment and learn that their parents' dignity had been defended. I thought about the Velvet Room, my past, and how the next person who found themselves there might be spit out into the world without a guide if people like Vanessa continued to weaponize shame. I did not want to be the person who let silence be a shelter for cruelty. "Speak at the conference," Henry said quietly the night before. He had a folder with the draft of what his statement might be. "Not to be dramatic, to be true. We'll present facts. We'll show the narrative you're most comfortable with." Do I have to? The rest of the question was swallowed by a nervous laugh. The idea of standing under lights and expecting people to understand felt like a new kind of labor. "No one should tell you what you have to do," he said.
But you should know I don't want anyone else deciding this story for you. The press conference took place 2 days later in a neutral room with neutral lighting, microphones, and a bank of cameras that looked like a forest. Henry stood beside me, his posture the calm one that had turned boardrooms into instruments. He introduced our spokesperson, someone from his PR team who spoke like a metronome, and then he spoke. He did not shout. He did not flail with indignation. He presented. He laid out a timeline, the incident at the Gilded Rose, the retrieval of security footage, the statements from staff, the evidence that the incident was deliberate and part of a pattern. He read short, precise passages, Vanessa's message, the owner's handling of me, the restaurant's attempts to obfuscate. When the cameras widened, he said what the world needed to hear with a voice that left no room for gossip to occupy the center. "This is not a story about a fallen socialite," he said. "This is a story about a public humiliation of a pregnant person in a private establishment and the responsibility of those in power to ensure safety in public spaces." There were cameras, and then there were questions, needle-like and urgent. A journalist asked why we hadn't gone to the police.
Henry answered, calmly and clearly. We had been consulting on that option. We had gathered evidence. We had given the restaurant every chance to take responsibility. There was a legal path we preferred, one that exposed malfeasance and sought repairs rather than theatrical punishment. Then came the moment no one expected. Our team released, under counsel, a verified copy of the prenatal paternity test. We did it not to be salacious, but to close the discussion that had shifted from the act of humiliation to a debate about my worthiness. In our world, where the alpha-omega dynamic carried social weight, the misrepresentation could be more damaging than the act itself. Rumors crept in and tried to spin lineage into spectacle. The document showed a clear, clinical match. It said in ink that could not be erased by conversations over cocktails that Henry was the father. The room exhaled. For me, the release of the result felt like a blade being lifted off a wound. It was evidence of belonging. It showed that I was not alone in this, that this life in my belly had someone who would stake a legal and personal claim against the lies. There was backlash, of course. People accused us of staging the event for PR. Some wrote anonymous think pieces about privacy and the wealthy. But more and more the coverage shifted from gossip to accountability. Columnists asked how a restaurant could allow an employee to humiliate a guest without discipline. Food writers, more moral than they admitted, were forced to ask about the ethics of fine dining and class. A local investigative piece followed the money and found that several of Gregory Sullivan's contracts had been awarded under suspicious circumstances. Small contracts with the city had been expedited with payments to connected accounts. Suppliers had been pressured to give favorable terms. The net gathered. Vanessa's social orbit began to feel like a house of cards that had been taxed by a gust of truth. Sponsors who'd once lined up to be seen with her pulled back when their lawyers looked over the public record. Investors in the Gilded Rose sought calls from accountants and grew nervous when auditors began asking questions about cash flow and unrecorded payments. Gregory Sullivan's construction company was subject to a third-party review when a client requested a copy of a contract that had odd clauses. Brendan York, who had been the picture of a conciliatory fiancé in public, found his name in internal memos that suggested he had been less than transparent about certain consultancies. Rumors have teeth. They bite. What Henry did, he did to the axes of law and reputation. He did not take a sledgehammer to anyone. He presented careful evidence and let the systems, boards of directors, bank compliance departments, municipal auditors, do what they were supposed to do when fed the truth.
There were freezes of accounts while investigations occurred. There were meetings that ended with severed partnerships. There were compliance audits that dragged executives into uncomfortable interviews. The Gilded Rose closed temporarily for an internal investigation, and some of its investors pulled their funding rather than risk association. The Sullivans reached out to negotiate. They were, predictably, a brassy, practiced kind of panic. Gregory sent a statement that tried to be conciliatory. Vanessa issued a longer apology that read like a press release more than remorse. She said she regretted making anyone feel uncomfortable and promised to reflect on her actions. She declined at first to sign any admission of liability, and the media said she wasn't being genuine. Then, as more papers found their way onto desks and more auditors found questions they liked to ask, the Sullivans' posture shifted. They made offers behind closed doors. They tried softening with donations and charities. Henry's legal team countered with demands, a public apology, compensation for reputational damage, and a commitment to staff training that would be overseen by an external agency. Eventually, a settlement was reached, no televised spectacle, but a list of consequences that included the Gilded Rose closing until it restructured,
mandatory sensitivity training paid for by the Sullivans, and a monetary restitution fund to be administered by a third-party nonprofit. Vanessa, who had once used other people's pain like confetti, had to look at her actions through the lens of lawyers and auditors. She was required to issue a public statement that included an apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The apology was measured, legally vetted, and utterly lacking the venom she had once used as an accessory. There were clauses about non-disclosure agreements, some of which Miss Sullivan asked for and some the legal team refused. The settlement favored not silence but structural change. It was not vengeance, it was repair. All of this unfolded while my life did what lives do, kept moving forward. I went back to class, I took clinical rotations, learned to draw blood without flinching, learned how to chart medication and hold someone's trembling hand as a stethoscope found a rhythm. I kept my shifts at the Velvet Room to the minimum, but I logged enough hours to maintain the delicate equilibrium that allowed me to eat and pay for textbooks. There were nights I studied until my eyes turned to grain. Henry would bring me dinner, a plate he had arranged with care, and sometimes he stayed while I read aloud watershed points from my textbooks. He didn't pretend to know the mechanics of nursing, but he sat like an audience who loved what they heard. I also began to make decisions that were mine. If Henry could wield resources to protect me, I could wield my voice to build something that might protect others.
With his help, but at my insistence, I started the groundwork for a small foundation, a scholarship for Omegas in precarious situations who wanted to pursue nursing or allied health careers. We called it the Armstrong Benjamin Fund, with a name that felt both clumsy and right. It would provide seed money for school fees, support for childcare, and a discreet fund for those who needed to leave exploitative work situations. It would not be a PR darling. It would be a lifeline. Starting a foundation was a different kind of labor. It required paperwork, bylaws, an advisory board, and a firewall between the money and the optics. Henry's CFO helped me set up an endowment. A few of his contacts connected me with grant writing coaches. We insisted the foundation be administered by professionals who had experience with vulnerable communities. Those who thought my past made me unfit to lead were surprised when the grant committee asked for my input. Lived experience became an asset. I didn't do interviews about the foundation. I wrote an op-ed, short, pointed, and published in a local paper about dignity and the need to ensure that people who had used sex work to survive were allowed paths into professional careers without being punished by stigma. The piece was careful and personal, and for the first time in a long time, my voice felt like something others listened to, with an openness that wasn't misplaced cruelty. Emails came in. Stories of people who had been humiliated, of parents who had been threatened by gossip, of young Omegas who wanted to go to school but didn't know how to pay for childcare. The foundation felt necessary in a way that tightened my chest and made me proud. There were also quieter moments, small sanctuaries that were not part of PR or lawsuits. Henry tended to them like chores he loved doing. He learned the names of my favorites on grocery labels. He left notes in my textbooks that said things like, "You're smarter than you think." He would hum while standing at the stove. He would wrap a blanket around me on cold nights and say, "There, that stays." Those ordinary sentences became ballast. The pregnancy advanced. My body changed in ways that were ordinary and miraculous. People I barely remembered sent well wishes. Some days I felt like a walking headline. Other days I felt like a mundane creature who was making soup. The baby moved, a persistent beat that cut through tension. Henry would sometimes rest his hand on my belly and close his eyes, a small man who became enormous with tenderness. When the birth approached, the world outside did its murmuring thing, social media theories, a few paparazzi trying to catch a glimpse, but Henry had prepared the ground with discretion. We had a small circle of chosen people, a midwife who had a reputation for gentle competence, a nurse who had been recommended by a friend, and a tiny staff team from Henry's security who were asked to be invisible rather than imposing.
We chose a hospital that allowed for privacy rooms and requested a low-key admission. The idea of control was partial at best. Birth, like grief, has its own agenda. Labor was a crisis of ordinary courage. It is impossible to describe the way sound compresses and expands during contractions, the way breath becomes a strategy, the way everything narrows into a single bright tunnel. Henry was both a calm presence and a fidgeting storm. He stayed beside the bed, holding my hand, whispering things that were equal parts math and love. He timed breaths with me and made jokes that were too feeble to be funny, but that somehow parceled relief. At one point, after a particularly sharp contraction, he draped his coat across my shoulders, the same coat that had once been a shield in a restaurant, and now a warm flutter over my sweating shoulders. The coat had become a narrative object in our life, shelter, claim, habitual care. The midwife joked about the coat, and Henry pretended offense, which made me snort laugh and weakened the tightening that preceded the next wave. The baby arrived in the small hours, like someone arriving late to a meeting and apologizing with an outrageous amount of life. She, screeched as if she had been waiting for applause. The room filled with a light I hadn't realized I was missing. When they placed her on my chest, I felt a solidity that was not only physical, but existential. There were no perfect metaphors for the way a new life creates a centripetal force. We named her Lily because, among small private reasons, lilies had been present in the hospital bouquet at the first ultrasound, and because the name felt like something soft and resilient. Henry cried once, just a single wet line down his face, and then bent to kiss her forehead like a man bestowing a benediction. The aftermath of birth is a place where the world feels both absurdly small and infinitely compassionate. People brought food, laughed at Henry's attempts to assemble a bassinet, and admired Lily's tiny fists. The Armstrong Benjamin Fund got a new logo while I was still recovering. Someone joked that the logo looked like a coat draped over a cradle. I laughed until my lungs hurt. Settlements wrapped up over the next months. Vanessa's restaurant never regained footing. The Gilded Rose reopened under new management with new policies and mandatory staff training. Its menu tasted the same, but the air felt different. The Sullivans faced audits, and their circle thinned as partnerships dissolved. Brendan York's consultancy dried up as clients worried about optics. None of this felt revelatory as spectacle. The collapse was a bureaucratic thing. Cancelled contracts, frozen vendor accounts, and the slow erosion of business relationships that once seemed indestructible. It was real, and it was a form of justice that tasted oddly like routine paperwork. Vanessa did what many people do when the world narrows. She retreated.
She issued a public apology. You could call it felicity couched in legal compliance, and agreed to the restitutions. I never craved seeing her grovel. I wanted her actions to change. I wanted the people she had humiliated to be recognized, not for my own sake, but for others who might come after. That was the whole point of the foundation and the publicity we decided to have. The goal wasn't to destroy a life. It was to recalibrate an environment that allowed humiliation for profit. Time, the quiet craftsman, did what it always does. I learned to interpret Lily's kicks like a language. Nursing school graduation came not as a surprise, but as a long-breathed ceremony. I walked across a stage wearing a cap that bobbed too easily. My mother cried in the audience and looked decades younger in that small, humbled way that money cannot touch. Henry sat in the front row, with Lily asleep in his arms. He had fallen into a domestic rhythm as natural as gravity. When I accepted my diploma, it felt less like an accolade and more like a ticket, proof that I had paid attention, that I had kept my head down and held on to a plan while the world tried to rewrite me. After graduation, we threw a small party in our townhouse. There were friends who had loved me before anyone thought I belonged to a coat, colleagues from school who had stayed despite the noise, and the odd person who only now expressed compassion, as if timing mattered. Henry cooked, again, and the kitchen filled with the smell of seared meat and rosemary. Lily dozed in a bassinet by the window. I watched him for a long time and felt an old, guarded part of me finally ease. There were hard conversations left. My father sent a message, brief, the kind of thing that suggested guilt without the courage to ask for forgiveness. I considered meeting him, but chose instead to create distance on my terms. Forgiveness, I learned, was not a thing to be given because someone demanded it. It was a slow work you did when you were ready. I told Henry I would meet him only if my terms were accepted, and Henry supported me without offering saccharine counsel. On a cool evening not long after graduation, we went up to the rooftop of the townhouse. The city lay in a scatter of lights, some brilliant, some dim. Henry leaned against the railing, Lily sleeping against his chest, bundled in a soft blanket that smelled of detergent and small things. I wrapped the coat tighter around my shoulders, even on that mild night. It had become an inheritance. What now? I asked. It was a big question for someone who had once learned to fetishize survival over planning. He smiled that small smile that had gotten me through more nights than I cared to count. Now we keep making things like this less likely, he said. We keep people safe. We keep your dignity intact. We build the fund. We teach hospitals to be kinder to Omegas. We buy a ridiculous number of baby sweaters. We live, I finished. The word was simple and brave.
We talked about boundaries, about how, if my father ever wanted to be a part of our lives, he'd have to be willing to account for his absence and to take steps that felt sincere, not performative, not seeking the headlines he had never cared to give before. We agreed forgiveness might be possible someday, but would not be demanded. We talked about Lily's future, about how we would answer questions she might have, how we'd teach her to be kind and resilient. Henry hummed a melody I recognized from the first months we spent together, and the city hummed along. Once, in a private moment on that rooftop, I thought about the coat, how it had been draped over me in a restaurant and then later in a delivery room, how it left an imprint on the fabric of my life. It was both a literal garment and a metaphor, a place someone had created that was mine to enter. I had learned that protection could be legal as well as tender. I had learned that power can be wielded without spectacle, with subpoenas and auditors and an insistence on process. I had learned to allow help, and yet to keep the shape of my own agency. I had learned that being visible is not the same as being vulnerable if you stand with people who will not let your story be written as someone else's entertainment. We raised Lily to a soundtrack of slow cooking and soft laughter. We taught her that names matter, and that when someone hurts another, the first step is to listen, not to gossip. We built the foundation slowly, prioritizing direct support over flashy events. We presented awards to students who had no other advocates. We opened a small childcare fund, so students, especially Omegas, could attend classes without being forced to choose between income and education. None of this fixed everything, but it made a patchwork of safety where there had been none. People ask sometimes if I resent the way my past has been parceled out, if I regret the way the city watched. I do not pretend to have no scars. The public humiliation left marks, sleeves of memory that sometimes itched when I least expected. But scars are maps too. They show the route you took, and sometimes that route lights the path for someone else. On quieter nights, when Lily curled against my chest and sighed like a small, satisfied creature, I would think of the early days, the velvet curtain, the restaurant, the cold splash of water. I would remember the smallness I felt then, and the way Henry stepped into the doorway like light. I would think about how we had chosen to answer cruelty with process and with truth, how we had chosen repair over spectacle. I would think about the people who had been there at the edges, our small, stubborn community, and how they had become our family. There are no tidy endings. People change. Some do not. Vanessa rebuilt a private life that did not include the city pages. Gregory's company limped into compliance. Brendan found work with less glamorous partners, and by some accounts, a quieter calendar.
The internet moved on, because the internet always does, and new spectacles took its place. But the things that mattered to me, Lily's laughter, the foundation's modest first scholarship recipient, my mother's hand in mine as my name was called at graduation, remained. On a day that felt like the weather had decided to be a good neighbor, I stood in a small auditorium and watched Lily crawl toward a pile of fabricies and toys. Henry sat beside me, his hand finding mine without looking. He had learned how to be quiet in public in ways that were neither showy nor apologetic. We had learned how to turn the tools of influence toward repair. If you think about it, the world often gives cruelty a stage because it loves spectacle. So we offered instead something less showy, a steady insistence that people be treated like whole human beings. It is not a flashy moral, but it is the work. Tell me what you think about Benji and Henry in the comments. If you like the story, subscribe for more.